as we get into part 9 here, this is going to be a somewhat different kind of discussion. We're going to be talking a lot about social changes here in the United States, here in the mid-1800s. We're going to be dealing with, in part, sort of women, what they're doing, but we're also going to be talking a lot about social history, both North and South, with what's going on, and we're going to have a somewhat detailed discussion of slavery, how it was affecting the South, how it was affecting the North, how it was affecting society and politics all around, and we'll get into some interesting personages with this discussion as well. One of the major changes taking place here in this sort of first quarter, first half of the 1800s is a real rise in a number of women reformers that were making their presence really, really felt. We had talked before about how Abigail Adams and a number of other sort of early women of the early republic had lobbied for important political roles for women. Society really wasn't, male society really wasn't quite ready for that kind of change yet. But when you live in a republic and you live in the idea that sort of the people have the power and they're the ones that are going to go out, they're going to shape society rather than waiting on sort of superiors above you, a king or a dictator or something like that, to change you from above, they're going to find outlets. And of course, these women are going to find these outlets. Now, when we look at who some of these women were, mostly they're going to be wealthy women. You're not going to see like sort of poor frontier women engaging in sort of changing the moral character of the nation. They're sort of engaged in survival at that point. But these are mostly wealthy women that have the time and the resources to be able to try to deal with some of society's problems. They're almost always white. Not always, but almost always white. And so these women are trying to find ways to get involved publicly. But they have to be careful because they don't want to challenge the social norms. Because challenging the social norms that was really bad. If you wound up as a woman of bad reputation, it wasn't just men who snubbed you, it was women who snubbed you. And so you didn't want to bring sort of a bad reputation on your family because your children would suffer from this kind of thing. So you had to be very, very careful about how you were perceived as a woman in society. It's a much stronger sort of sensibility of sort of social networking, how you were received by your peers than really we have today. I mean, it's still important, don't get me wrong, but the rigidity with which these women sort of had to deal with society is nothing like what we see today. So how do you go through and you do this? Well, the church is really great cover. A lot of this is going to be moral reform or charitable works, and of course, you can use the church as cover for these activities. When we say, well, I'm not going out here as a politician, I'm not going out here as just a private citizen. I'm a member of this church, and our ladies guild or our ladies group is doing this because we're interested in these kinds of things, right? Well, these women go after a number of failings and problems in society. They went after alcohol. Alcohol they saw as a major problem, so the big temperance movements of the United States often had women at kind of the nucleus of this. It wasn't an all-female movement, but you're going to see that a lot of women are going to gravitate towards that. And of course, that then set them in a strong anti-immigrant stance, because in many cases, it's easy for us to look at alcohol, which was or anti-alcohol campaigns, which were put forward, which is, well, Jesus doesn't want you to be drunk all the time. Beat your wife, pick up nasty, STDs from the women at the beer hall, get in fights, that kind of thing. Waste your family's money. And so it's a moral evil. But in many cases, it's actually, hey, we don't like immigrants, so it's easier for us to go after the alcohol, right? Than that kind of thing. Because if you go after the immigrants themselves, you get beat up. And in some cases, you get beat up. You're also going to see that the prison system in the United States at this point was pretty brutal. It was bad. I mean, it was ridiculously bad. In some cases, it was literally holes in the ground, with like a cage on top. And so you sometimes you'll see that in like prison movies, or the police will say, "We're going to throw you in a hole in the ground." At one point, that wasn't a euphemism. That was like you got put in jail, and it's just like open the lid, throw them in, close the lid. So the prison system was bad in that regard. The really unsanitary kind of conditions. The people get kind of tossed in there. In many cases, were just sort of forgotten. Some of them were farmed out for labor, where they're kind of worked to death. You're also going to see putting into this as well is the asylum system. Many people who were crazy, that lacked the capacity to completely understand their actions. Today, we would put them in a mental institution and say, look, this person is not mentally competent. They can't, they may have stabbed somebody, but, they talk to their thumb. So they're crazy. And we need to do something different with them rather than try to punish them. You can't punish somebody for being crazy. It's not their fault, okay? At that point, in a lot of cases, they didn't make a distinction between this. They put these people in lunatic asylums that in many cases they were prisons. In some cases, they just threw them straight into prison. One of these women reformers, she had herself locked up as a supposed lunatic in one of these places for a period of time so that she could see what it was really like. And she didn't tell anybody except the people that were going to come and get her out later that she wasn't insane. And she saw how these people were treated and she wrote about it. And it was shocking. It is really, really bad kind of stuff that's going on here. And of course, that served to help spur change. Maybe we need to not have this kind of system here in America. You got, straight up in many cases, charitable activities of helping the poor. You'll see this with starting campaigns to food and clothing, shelter for some of these poor people. And we're going to see, especially in the North, a lot of these women reformers are going to be interested in abolition, ending the slavery system. Now you're going to see some of these women, the very sort of early edge, are going to advocate for female suffrage, for the vote, right? But really, that movement, we're at this point before the Civil War, it's a little too early for that movement to have a lot of traction because these women are getting involved in a lot of causes that they're seeing some activity on, and they're really not quite to the point where they're sort of banging pots and pans for the vote quite yet. That's going to be the later 1800s when that finally happens. By mid-century, though, when you look at some of the changes for how women are treated in society, the women that had not had property rights before now have the ability to own their own property, even if they're married, maintain that property for the most part after the death of their husband, that it doesn't automatically go to some male relative, and had made the gain. They were able to make contract rights, which is if you're going to engage in any kind of business, borrowing money, laying out money, forming business partnerships, you've got to have contract rights. And if you're not a full member of society that can be legally held accountable, you can't engage in a contract, you can't engage in business. And so these women, especially the ones that are married, that have fewer rights than women that aren't married, are able to make these advances, for the most part, by the 1850s. So here you can see some of these women reformers, what they look like sort of by the 1830s, 1840s. And you never see any of these women that look terribly happy. I don't know if reforming, dealing with the dregs of society, just sort of make you look dour and sad, or if just, that kind of work just draws in the dour and sad women. So, anyway. When we look at the two major social evolutions that are taking place, you can draw it on a map at this point in American history. And that's, you got the North and you got the South. All right. When you look at the South, by this point, definitely by the last 20 years, and really even more than that, the last sort of 40 years, in the run-up to the American Civil War, cotton is king. Cotton is king in the South. And in a lot of ways, cotton is kind of king elsewhere, too. But when you look at the structure of society, cotton completely dominated the American economy, especially in the South, and part of the world's economy and its society as well. By the 1850s, the southern part of the United States produced 75% of the world's supply of cotton. So 3 out of every 4 cotton balls came from the U.S. South. This is a stranglehold monopoly on really the world's supply of cotton. Now, this becomes important for what's going on outside the South because, well, where does this cotton go? They grow it in the South, they bale it up, they gin it, and then they send it somewhere, right? Where does it go? Because, it doesn't come off the plant as shirts or socks or stuff like that. You've got to send it someplace for that. Well, U.S. northern factories, right? So factories in the northern part of the United States would buy cotton from the South. They would buy it. And then, of course, they would take the cotton and then they're going to spin it and they're going to weave it and they're going to turn it into silly hats or whatever it is you make with cotton here in the 1800s. So all of their workers, like it or not, are dependent upon the South. This was also true for the British. The British had long had a history of dominance in the field of textiles. First had been wool, and then with the introduction of cotton, they make the transition from wool to cotton. And so if you're a British factory worker, or a dock worker, or a shipping agent, or something like that, you're partly dependent upon cotton deliveries from the South for the raw material of your livelihood. If the cotton just, stopped flowing one day, you're out of work. You work at the mill that makes shirts, and you know what? They decided that they didn't really like making cotton anymore, so we don't have any more. You're out of work for at least a while, right? So cotton, thus, is going to hold a lot of economic power, and with that economic power, then is going to come social power and political power as a result of that as well. And so this is what cotton looks like for those of you who've just never seen it. What's this cotton stuff that he's talking about, right? But it becomes so important that actually it becomes a musical. This is Old King Cotton, the musical, right, by George P. Morris. And the music, and so the lyrics are by Morris, and music by maybe his brother, I don't know, William H. Morris. It was a musical that was put on in New York, and this is the playbill from it. So I don't know how you turn cotton into a musical. Maybe it's like a puppet show. I don't know. Anyway, so that's how important this becomes socially. All right. So when we look at the effect that cotton has on the immediate social structure of the South, it's going to shatter the South into three very distinct, essentially non-permeable strata of Southern society. And the first of these, the ones that are sort of at the top of the pyramid, is the cotton aristocracy. All right, cotton is going to produce fantastic wealth for the planter class. Okay, for the most part, when you think about the Old South and you see these Old South mansions, these huge sort of sprawling complexes of wealth and power and things like that, that's from the cotton era. It's from the cotton era of the South. You go backwards into the 1700s. For example, if you go to George Washington's house at Mount Vernon, George Washington was making pretty good money. Okay, he was making pretty good money with his tobacco and other things that he was growing on his plantation. He's pretty rich for a guy in the 1700s. Okay, you then compare his house at Mount Vernon, which is pretty well off. Okay, with some of these cotton mansions, and Mount Vernon would fit inside some of these places. I mean, there are some of these ridiculous, insane amounts of money that these guys are making, especially early on in the cotton boom. All right. As a result of that, these cotton planters, the guys that own and operate the plantations, they become the leading citizens of the South. They have the money, and thus they are going to have the power. In many cases, they become the local leaders, elected to the county commission, elected to the city council, elected to the state legislature, elected governor. In many cases, of course, they're also going to be the national statesmen from these places. You don't see the poor people running for office. All right, it's just not going to happen. And so, as a result of that, we're going to see that the leadership, the political leadership of these places, is going to be almost exclusively funneled through the prism of cotton and, of course, the concomitant labor system of slavery that goes right along with it. Okay. Well, as this goes on, all right, generation after generation, we're going to see that the planter class begins to view itself basically as an inherited aristocracy. That we're above everybody else. My kid is going to be above these people for a while, and then his kid is going to be above those people's grandkids for a while. And so that's going to make some important social changes on your outlook of life. And of course, these people are going to be the ones to afford education for their children. And also, you just look at it on a day-to-day kind of basis, and you say, well, how come you guys are so much in charge of society? Well, we're the ones that are in charge of this huge minority of the population that, if it wasn't for us, they would get completely out of hand and they would start murdering and raping and slaughtering and burning, and that is the black slaves. So our social control is because we have an important place in society, not only economically, but already socially, because you don't want the black people to run wild, do you? So this is the ideology behind it. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that this is the pitch that they begin to make. So this gives you an idea. This is one of these three-story, giant, cotton plantation mansions, and you can see they got enough money to have little stone statues out back, giant sort of maze to give them entertainment. There's no PlayStation available quite yet, so you got to make do with what you can get. So let's look at the other end. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum here of cotton society, and that is African American slaves. All right. Well, the slave trade with Africa is going to end in 1815. This had been something that the North had thought would put an end to slavery altogether, but it didn't. All right. What that meant was, if you wanted to engage in cotton-style agriculture using black slave labor, you couldn't bring it in from Africa anymore to augment the numbers. So that meant that you had to rely on now an institutional slavery, meaning that if the slave owner owns the slaves, then the slave owner's son needs to own the slave's sons. And then the slave owner's son's son, his grandson, is going to have to own their grandchildren. As this goes forward several generations, you've got one group of people and their whole line owning another group of people and their whole line. And yeah, you'll have slave trading and different kind of things will change occasionally, but that society, generally speaking, is you're going to have one group of people owning another group of people in perpetuity. All right? And don't think that that doesn't have a strong sort of social and psychological impact on how these people view how their world is supposed to operate. Okay? So what that means is you got to have the slaves reproduce. And that's the only sort of way to go forward with this system that they want to, because that is then going to be the way that they're going to make this fantastic amount of money. The slaves themselves thus become the number one commodity asset for the planters. If you were to look at the asset breakdown of these cotton plantations, it's in terms of value. It wasn't the land that it was on. It was like 3,000 acres. Yeah, whatever. Land's cheap. You get some more of that. It wasn't even the fancy building. It wasn't the equipment. It wasn't the seed. It wasn't anything else. And you look at how much money they had tied up in their investment. Most of it was in the slaves themselves, because slavery, the slaves now is a limited commodity. It is governed completely by their own reproduction. You can't bring any more supply in, and as demand is going up, that is going to cause an ever-increasing spike in the price. As a result of that, the slaves are worked extremely heavily in order to maximize the return on the investment. As the investment goes up, if a slave goes from being $100 to $200 to $400 to $800, you look at it and you say, listen, if I spent $800 on a slave and I don't get $800 out of the slave, then I've lost money. And it's going to take longer to recoup the losses on purchasing slaves. So as a result of that, we're going to have to work these people a lot harder and a lot longer, produce more resources, so that way I can get a return on this investment. They are kept in extremely rough conditions, cheap clothing, and only subsistence food. This gives you an idea of the slave cabin, slave lifestyle, and the clothes look kind of like rags. Yeah, it's because for the most part they are worn out, nasty old clothes. Log cabin doesn't exactly look like it's put together in the best way. But this is what you would see. You would go into the South and you'd find black field hands all out there picking cotton. And this picture makes its way onto the front of the Bank of Greensboro, $2 note that they were issuing for their bank. And he looked pretty happy. Picking cotton is awesome. I don't know that it was necessarily that good of a system for these people. I suspect that it wasn't. All right. So when you look at how difficult life is for these slaves, the immediate sort of thought that comes up is, well, beatings, right? Whippings. And when you start to break this down, you've got to understand that a lot of this, while it develops a social context, at the core heart of all of it is it's a business. The goal of this is to make money, all right? And so it's not really a good idea to just haul some slave out anytime they do something you don't like and just whip them with the cat of nine tails. Because you're going to, the back's going to go all bloody, they're probably going to get some infection, and you're either going to have to give them several days off to recover, or send them back out in the field and make them work again after losing several pints of blood and watch them die. So it's a money-losing proposition all the way around. So a lot of these guys were very hesitant to beat their slaves, at least in an extremely violent manner. So if you were to look at it from sort of the point of view and say, okay, we're going to drop ourselves into the sort of the eyeballs of a slave here on one of these plantations, how often am I going to get beaten? Statistically speaking, probably not very often. All right, it's just not a good idea to do that. All right, it's not smart to do that. Now you did have the big differences between master and master. Some of these guys were real jerks. They just like hitting people, and it made them feel good to hit people. So you may know some people like that don't have anything to do with slavery. So the odds of being badly beaten yourself are pretty low. The odds of, especially the larger the plantation you get and the less personal contact you'll see with the master, the odds of you seeing someone beaten are pretty high. And the idea is it instills discipline, and if you break that rule, then all right, everybody gather around and we're going to watch this guy get beaten. So that way you'll all know, don't cross me, and then I won't have to beat you. Okay? So the discipline was constant, and it was often very severe. Now, in some cases, you saw lesser punishments, like they'd be whipped with a very small sort of string, as a sort of reminder, punches to the back of the head, and of course a lot of you say, I wouldn't put up with that kind of thing. Yeah, you'd have been killed, okay? And those of you with a real sort of rebellious streak that I'm not going to put up with being hit by anybody, yeah, you die. You die. You go after this guy with a knife or something like that, you hold him down in the river and strangle him, yeah, you won't have to be hit anymore until you're killed, okay? And I'd go down like a martyr. Yeah, the important thing is you'd go down. And you wouldn't survive, and you wouldn't live to see another generation. And so for those people that didn't want to die, you had to conform to the system. And that's just kind of how it was. Now you did have, you had Stoner Rebellion, you had Nat Turner, you had some of these slave rebellions and things like that, but they didn't go anywhere, okay? And in fact, one of the worst problems that you'll see that people, both white and black, complained about with this was not necessarily the beatings, although the beatings received quite a bit of attention, was the breakup of slave families. a lot of these guys are broken up and sold off like cattle. You have a wife, you have children, you have a husband, you've got family members, and then, well, you know, I could keep you here, or I could sell you that guy to make $800. Wow. You know, slave trading thus becomes a huge business, especially on the rivers of the interior of America. The Mississippi becomes kind of the highway of slavery. The Deep South begins buying a lot of the slaves that were being sold off by the Upper South as large-scale plantation. Cotton doesn't do quite as well in the northern tier of southern states, you know, kind of the Virginia, Tennessee kind of belt. And so they've got a lot of slaves that they can either set free or sell to people in the South, and that's what they're going to do. And so these people are going to get put in chains, they're going to get marched overland, or they're going to get literally sold down the river, go to places like New Orleans where they were then put into sort of warehouse facilities where they're then sold off to masters in Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, that kind of thing. So now, many of these guys ever increasingly are going to try to run away, right? Because the system sucks, right? And you'll eventually see the establishment of the Underground Railroad, of a string of sort of wayposts to get out of the South to the northern part of the United States. But of course, if you're still in the United States, slave catchers can still conceivably get a hand on you. So if you can make it all the way to Canada, which is a totally separate country, eventually, and no slavery there, you will see eventually they'll be able to do that using, of course, the complicity of a lot of non-slavery favoring whites. And so you can see this is the effect. This is the effect of this discipline. This is a post-Civil War photograph of a Southern field hand. This guy had been whipped so badly, so often that he had crisscrosses and scars. Looks sort of like the back of a manatee, you know, as they're sort of badly treated. And this is what you'd see in the fields. You got a white overseer on a horse looking after black field hands who are picking cotton. And this is what you would see when there was discipline to be meted out, and that is you take the slave and you tie him to a tree. You got the other workers in the background so that they can see him being whipped for whatever infraction. But in fact, much of the day-to-day life on the southern plantation was done by the slaves themselves, and for the most part, you know, relatively sort of peaceable agreement. Not always, and it varied from person to person. But this is what's going on, and some of them, you know, are actually pretty skilled positions. So when you look at the culture here of African American slaves at this point, what is endemic of these people's culture, right? One, of course, is if you've got a lot of tumult in your life and you don't know from minute to minute whether you're going to be beaten or sold or something like that, you need some kind of bedrock, you know, anchor to sort of hold your life together. And of course, marriage is the typical sort of human response to, well, society's screwy, man. I don't know what we're going to do. Well, you get married and you got, you know, sort of a nice foundation with that. Well, they're going to do this, but of course, their marriages are not obliged to be recognized by law. They are property. They're owned by somebody. And if the guy decides that he's going to sell the woman to one place and the guy to someplace else, your marriage is null and void. All right? And you would see this reflected in the slave marriage ceremony, where, for those of you who have ever been to a wedding, which, you know, hopefully some of you have, the usual sort of incantation that goes with this is, "Till death do us part." I know that a lot of people don't take that very seriously anymore, but that's the idea, that marriage is supposed to be this permanent kind of thing. And they would actually add, you know, "till death or distance do us part." And it was not uncommon, especially after slavery comes to an end, that some woman who had married some guy because her first husband had been sold off, her first husband comes back and finds her, and awkward, you know, you've got sort of two husbands. So you've got these weird situations that you've got to try to work through. And of course, you've got the immediate sadness of the fact that you're married and then your spouse is taken and put someplace else. We're also going to see throughout this period a strong embrace of Christianity. And initially, especially when we talk about the late 1700s, they're admitted to white churches, right? But we're going to see that the hyper-conservative ideas about slavery and about race are going to sweep through definitely by the 1820s or so. You can see it pretty strong here by the 18 teens. And we're going to see whites become a lot more denigrated towards blacks as an overall race. We're up here, you guys are down here, that kind of thing. And so separation along racial lines becomes pretty concrete. So work is going to dominate the cultural lives of the slaves. Many of these, if they were offered the opportunity by their master, they would work extra because you're not necessarily needed every day, right? You see this in a lot of examples of urban slavery, where if you're a slave in a big city and you're going to be working for cash money, hey, allow me to work on the days that you don't need me. I'll go work for somebody else, and I'll take the money, and if you'll allow me to then buy myself from you, that's what we'll do. And so this was, of course, up to the master. The master said, "Oh, you're going to work extra? Yeah, all that money you make, yeah, that's mine." You could do that, all right. But a lot of these guys, they worked out good. In some cases, they worked out good relationships with their slaves, and they said, "Okay, you pay me what I paid for you, and then we'll call it square." But on the plantation itself, right, at night especially, you've got song, dance, culture such as storytelling is going to flow from these slaves, and this is what's going to keep them knit together as a community. This is the broom that they would jump over. It was often referred to as jumping the broom or hopping over the broom, and that was the symbol of the married couple's new life together. They would join hands, they would jump over it, and of course it became a symbolic kind of thing. But a lot of these guys are going to try to escape, and you would see posters like this all up for bounty hunters, for slave catchers to try to bring these guys back. So we talked about the top, we talked about the bottom. What about the people in the middle? And that is white people that didn't own slaves. Only 25% of Southern whites actually owned slaves. That meant that 75% of the white people in the South didn't own any. And actually, a fairly large chunk of the 25% of the white people that owned slaves only owned a few, up to like 7 or so. And as a result of that, they had developed pretty strong sort of personal relationships with their slaves. It was not like they were sitting on the porch and sort of telling all these, this army of slaves, what to do in the fields. They were out in the fields, working amongst them. But a lot of these people viewed this slavery was the entry point for wealth. But what this meant was the South really had no functional middle class. By the eve of the Civil War, you can start to see it in a few places where they're starting to get some professional class people that are coming in. But for the most part, you don't have good access into the middle class because if you're at the bottom, you don't have access to good education as much. You don't have access to those kinds of jobs that are going to then, they're kind of low-end jobs now, but they'll eventually allow you to save your money and you can get into some better work as you professionally develop. Because all the low-end work, for the most part, is going to be done by the slaves themselves for free. They're slaves. The best land, of course, is going to go to the planters. The planters are going to be able to afford to buy all of this, of the really, really rich, bottomland kind of soil for growing cotton and growing all the cash crops that they've got on their plantation. What that means is you've got the less valuable soil around the margins. And you've got these poor whites are forced to use this for subsistence agriculture. You did have towns, you did have villages, but of course they're all just based on the overall agricultural economy, which is completely dominated by the planters. So most of these non-slave owning whites, a lot of them, especially in the rural areas, they live in pretty shabby shacks. A lot of these guys are dirty. They make very little money. Now many of them, though, you say, well, why do you support a system like this? There's no real kind of social ladder for you to climb out of this. And that is they can look on this and say, hey, well, at least I'm not a slave. Because many of them hoped to eventually own slaves to climb their way out. So when you look at the normal sort of social ladder, which is you get an education and you work yourself up to a certain point, and you develop sort of a set of social and professional skills that will allow you to advance economically. Nah, that's not how the slave system works. The way you advance economically is you get some slaves of your own and you make them work for you. Right or wrong, this was the concept that had begun to develop in most people's minds of how this operated. So when you look at the thoughts of, hey, we need to really get rid of slavery. What? Not only is this going to go after sort of wealthy people, but in some cases, a lot of the poor people view this as, you're taking away our opportunity for the future. So this is how sort of topsy-turvy the slave system had caused a lot of people to view society. Now, when you look at all of these, okay, you have a strong honor code system that's going to develop. The way that the honor code system, whether it's dueling or fighting, depending on which sort of social strategy we're in, there's a sort of a set of the rules that kind of go along with it. And you don't cross any of these lines. If you're a rich white planter, you don't duel somebody that's a poor white guy. You definitely don't duel a black slave, okay? And if you're white, you don't have to, meet some black guy on the field of honor, because to do so would basically be stooping down to somebody else's level. If you're a rich white guy and some poor guy bumps into you and you say, hey, get away from me, jerk, and the guy, I demand satisfaction. You don't have to meet that guy's challenge. You just smack him on the head with your cane and you ride off, or you hire a couple of thugs to beat the crap out of that guy. So within social situations, though, you say something bad about my wife and you're a rich guy and I'm a rich guy, well, we'll meet at pistols at dawn or something like that, right? So In amongst the other classes, though, they're probably not going to have access to sabers, and have a big, fight on top of a waterfall or anything dramatic like that. They're just going to go straight for fisticuffs. And actually, one of these examples that I was reading about, this foreign traveler heading to the South, 1830s, 1840s, and he talks about this fight that breaks out. And I hesitate to call it a duel, but I think it was a duel of honor anyway. And it sort of rolls out into the street where this guy can see it. And these guys are sort of fighting, back and forth, and eventually this one guy sort of knocks the other guy down and plops down on his chest while he's on the ground. And Southern men, a lot of these guys that at this point, they grew their thumbnails really, really long so that they could disfigure their opponents. And what he does is he digs his thumbnails into the guy's eye sockets and pulls out his eyes. Ah! So the crowd, hooray! Well, the fight's not over yet, despite the fact that the guy's now blind. He's able to sort of surge forward and bite off the other guy's nose. So his honor is at least partially restored, despite the fact that he's going to be a blind guy for the rest of his life. So this is how these guys sort of view their kind of honor status in the world at this point. Right? So now we flip the other side of the equation. Right? When we look at what's going on in the North, we will eventually see by the 1830s or so a very visible movement of, okay, we're against slavery and we're going to try to go against it, or we're going to try to abolish it. And we refer to this as the abolition movement or abolitionism. Right? And what had started out as just kind of a generic kind of, I don't really like slavery, eventually advances stronger and stronger, and you get more and more people until finally you can notice a sizable chunk of people, not a majority yet, all right, of people that are pretty actively opposed to it by the 1830s or so. Now it's going to be strongest in the Northeast. You'll see around the Boston area, Massachusetts, Maine, that kind of area, but in a lot of other places as well, New York, and it kind of lessens the further south and the further west that you go. But typically, a lot of the people that you're going to find here in the early vestiges of the abolition movement are going to be wealthy members of society. And the reason they're opposed to it is for the humanitarian side of it. They see that this is cruel to beat people, to separate families, that kind of thing. It's un-American to sort of one person own another, that kind of thing. Now, you will see eventually as more poor people in Northern society begin to get on board, and it's going to be a little bit later, okay? And this is especially true of immigrants. They thought that slavery should end as well, right? But not because they were really worried about, the poor plight of black people, because generally speaking, they had about as racist an attitude of Southern blacks as Southern whites did, okay? And they were also worried that, of course, if black people ever kept moving in increasing numbers to northern cities, they would take the same jobs that they wanted. So it's not for that reason. But a lot of them were worried about slavery spreading beyond its current confines. And eventually you'd see slavery everywhere, and slave labor would replace their own wage industrial labor, which is a legitimate sort of concern. That, what happens when slavery makes the jump from agriculture to industry? They won't hire any of us anymore. They'll just get slaves to do all that work. Well, abolitionists themselves are going to speak out against the evils of the system, okay? But when you do that, you're going to anger the South. You criticize these people, hey, the system that you're engaged in is evil. You call me evil? And we're going to see that as this political discourse gets more and more and more heated, we shouldn't be surprised that eventually it erupts into open war. This is the Liberator, the newspaper, abolitionist newspaper put out by William Lord Garrison. It was based in New York City, and basically it was sort of the collect-all aggregator for all things abolitionism. What was going on, the evils of slavery in the South, what different groups were meeting, where they were meeting, what they were doing, what they were saying. It was designed to sort of spread the word and to stimulate action to oppose slavery. Some of the best people to get to oppose slavery are people who had been slaves themselves. And so the abolitionists, you can get up and you can say, well, slavery is evil, slaves are beaten, and you're going to see a lot of people in the North, one, they don't care, and two, a lot of them are saying, hey, you need to shut up because you're going to cause a war. And I really don't want there to be a war. And so you're going to see a lot of opposition, in some cases for racial reasons. So the idea that sort of everybody in the North was this, they're linking arms or swaying back and forth about how they hate slavery, no. No, it never really like that. So when these people would get up and say, talk about how evil slavery is, you're some rich white lady, like you'd know. Well, okay, we need to find some people who have been enslaved, and they need to get up and tell us their story. And so they're going to make use of people who had been freed as slaves, or in some cases escaped. The best example of this, and not the only one, the one I'm going to use for the case study, is Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass had escaped from slavery, and basically, instead of just running off and hiding, because who would blame him if he did, but instead he decided to become an advocate to end the system of slavery as he knew it. He traveled all around in the North, and eventually he would travel to England as well, and he spoke out against the practice. He talked about how evil it was, he talked about the beatings, he talked about the families being separated, he talked about how immoral it was. But like I said, there were a lot of people that were opposed to this. In some cases, they just didn't like black people. In some cases, they were worried about it causing war. In some cases, they were Democrats that didn't want to sort of upset the political apple cart and allow Republicans to win elections. In some cases, these abolitionists, and Douglas is included, received death threats. In one case, at least, he was beaten and left for dead. So you had to face a significant amount of opposition to go and speak out against slavery. Now, the radical abolitionists, these are the people that weren't sort of squeamish about, saying what they thought. They didn't have a plan of like, well, eventually slavery ought to end. Somebody ought to do something about it. No, the radical abolitionists were ones that like, slavery's got to end right now. We want Congress to act and just declare slavery illegal. Okay. So you saw a lot of people that were kind of, a little bit more lukewarm about it. They say, yeah, I don't think slavery's good, but I don't know that we have to take radical action right away. But the radicals were the ones that were kind of the fire breathers. They were the ones that were the most active in organizing anti-slavery activities. And actually, you're going to see that they're pretty unpopular in the North at first, but eventually this idea is going to take root and is going to gain strength over time. Well, as Southerners are absorbing this, either in the halls of Congress or in the newspapers or on the street in discussion, they become more and more intolerant of questions about what they refer to as a peculiar institution. Yeah, you guys got your labor system up north with immigrants and poor workers in the factories. We've got ours in the South. It's really not a whole lot different. In fact, we actually take care of our people and like the wages that you pay them. And then, of course, to hear all this stuff coming out of these abolitionists, oh man, it is going to drive these guys into a white-hot frenzy. This is Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. This is his autobiography. If you get a chance, it's easy to read. It's a lot of fun. I read this in high school. It really is very illuminating to hear, primary sources that are a lot of, they're really approachable with that kind of thing. There aren't a whole lot. Some of them are kind of turgid kind of stuff. But you get some good ones every now and then. So you've got some people that are speaking out. What if you want to do more than just talk about it? What if you want to actually help slaves not be slaves anymore? Well, unless you're actually in Congress, you can't do a whole lot about it unless you help slaves escape. And so you're going to see that some of these Northerners are going to take that active leap. And that is they're going to help these escaped slaves get to freedom on a string of these outposts that are referred to the Underground Railroad. It was neither underground nor a railroad, but that's how nicknames work, okay? And these guys have got to find sympathetic Northerners that are going to, give them food, hide them from the authorities, or point them in the right direction, tell them where the next way station is going to go. And it's really random at first. You've got to, the people that you run into, if they're anti, black people, they're going to turn you back in, and they get a reward, right? So you've got to be very, very careful with this. And of course, once somebody just lucks out and learns the route to go from the South to the North, how are the other slaves that are still stuck on the plantation, how are they going to learn that route? You're going to have to go back and tell them and get them. And of course, not a lot of these people who find freedom are going to be so ready to risk losing it by going back to the South. But the most famous of all these people that are going to do that is a woman named Harriet Tubman. And she is nicknamed one of these conductors. She also had the nickname Moses, leading people out of slavery to freedom. She is going to escape. She's going to learn the route to the North, and then she is going to come back, first for her family and then for others. And allegedly, she is going to return many, many times, rescuing over 300 slaves. Now, both sides of this debate have a reason to overinflate the numbers of slaves being liberated on the Underground Railroad. Southerners, they have a property right. Okay, they'll be like me going to your house and say horses and cows and cats ought to be free, and I'm going to let them go. And you say, well, those are my property. Those are my, I own them, and they have a certain economic value. So the Southerners are going to say, hey, they're letting huge numbers of these slaves out, so they overinflate the numbers in that way. And of course, the people, the abolitionists, they want to look like they're having a huge impact, so they overinflate the numbers as well. It's a little hard to gauge exactly how many people were liberated on the Underground Railroad, but of course the Southerners demand the government come in and say, hey, what about our property rights? And of course the North is saying, hey, we're helping people escape. So you're seeing a lot of tension as a result of that. So here's an artist rendition. This is Harriet Tubman leading people through the swamp, helping these slaves escape as they're trying to avoid the bloodhounds that are tracking them down, as they're trying to get their way off to the north to get to freedom. And I included this in the slideshow because Harriet Tubman's got a gun, and there's no record of Harriet Tubman having a gun, at least not any of the ones that I've read. I mean, maybe she did, but you know, the chicks with the giant shotguns just really kind of appeal to me. So anyway, if you don't like it, you can go get your own history class, make your own slideshow. So anyway, that's it for this section.